Good morning, Megapodlings. It's Crazy Joe. I have a guest with me today. He is the CEO of Creator VC and the founder of Creator VC, and they are producing not one but four documentaries in various stages of development, from already released to coming next year, uh, on movies of the '80s. It started with In Search of Last Action Heroes, which was a documentary about '80s action films. Then we got In Search of Darkness, which is a documentary of horror films of the '80s. And now they're in the middle of a campaign for In Search of Darkness 2. And coming next year is In Search of Tomorrow, which is a sci-fi documentary. This is Robin Block. Welcome, Robin. We appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. Really looking forward to having a chat with you and sort of explaining a bit more about what we do and what we're trying to achieve.
Well, I'll tell you, prior to a couple months ago, I hadn't heard of any of these. At the beginning of the whole pandemic, you guys were offering a a deal for a digital version of In Search of Darkness, and I thought, oh, what is this? This sounds interesting, and that kind of led me to you. I've watched both In Search of Action Heroes and In Search of Darkness now, and you've just started the campaign for In Search of Darkness Part Two. So I guess we should just say to anyone who doesn't know, these are really long, in-depth documentaries, really digging in to the subject matter. Like In Search of Darkness is 4 hours long.
4.5 hours
Four
altogether.
and a half.
Yeah, and so's part two, actually. And what's different about In Search of Darkness is it's the most celebrated horror documentary ever produced, but also it's the biggest assembly of 80s horror icons ever put on screen. And in fact, In Search of Darkness Part 2 has even more 80s icons. So everyone we couldn't get for Part 1 has actually come on board now. So it's phenomenal. I actually watched it last night because the production team are in the final stages of post-production. So In Search of Darkness Part 2 isn't crowdfunded. We paid for that ourselves. So it's just a pre-order. And the pre-order is really there because part of what makes us different as an entertainment company is we really want our customers to feel a personal connection to the work that we do. So with In Search of Darkness 2, you get your name in the credits and you get a year's long immersive experience with 80s horror. So we've got all the biggest horror stars coming on live and direct to do watch parties, guest Q&As, and it's all about bringing people together through a shared interest, and that's what we're all about as a company.
Well, it's really exciting. I saw the trailer for In Search of Tomorrow before I saw the trailer for In Search of Darkness 2, and I can't wait to see that one. I'm more of a sci-fi guy than a horror guy, but I love them both. And this is just, I mean, I watched, you say 4.5 hours. I watched In Search of Darkness in one sitting, and it goes by really quickly. And I watched it with a notebook because there were movies in there I'd never seen before. And every time you'd get to a movie I hadn't seen before, I'd be jotting it down. And I still have a list of movies that I got to watch now that somehow slipped by me in the '80s.
Yeah, I mean, I love it. We get that a lot. I love hearing that because that's what it's all about. What we're trying to deliver is something which is a binge watchable, memorable experience. And we do go through very fast because it's important to keep people's attention span, but it's in depth and it feels like a very immersive experience. So on our social media, people are always saying, "Oh, I watched this film because I found out about it in Search of Darkness." And that's kind of what makes us different as a production company. So we don't want to be in the film industry. We don't want to be in the TV industry. We want to create and develop our own industry. It's what I call community powered entertainment. So it's live and direct with the very audience. We're very sort of collaborative in that sense. And we got so much amazing feedback and criticism for In Search of Darkness 1 that we applied it all to In Search of Darkness 2. And that's what we're really excited about right now.
So I guess and this is another four, is this 4.5 as well? Or
Yeah, it's 4.5. I watched it last night for the first time and it's phenomenal. And we've got people like Robert England, Tom Savini, Robert Russell, Linnea Quigley. We got all new people, and all the best people from the first one are back as well. And it's just, I just love it. It's just, I just found myself feeling really contented watching this, like it was a big comfort blanket. And in my house, I've got a big fireplace with a TV above it. So I had the fire going. I had In Search of Darkness Part 2, had like a chocolate bar, all cozy. It's very cold in England right now. And I was just like, this is what I want you to experience. I love it. And it was fascinating. I was learning things. And these are the best people in the world to talk about this. These are the people that made what 80s horror is for us. And it was wonderful.
Well, I guess that's a good question right there. Regarding 80s horror, I was just watching recently an interview with Joe Bob Briggs. And Joe Bob was talking about how on his shows, going back to the show he did in the 80s or the 90s, his current show on Shudder, they get more requests, he said, for 80s horror than any other era. Now, I'm a fan, but I'm also 44 years old, so for me, it's the era I grew up in. It's nostalgia. But he was saying how no, it's not just the nostalgia. It's not just the people who grew up through it. It's the teenagers and the kids in their 20s. They're all obsessed with 80s horror. What is it about the 80s that is just so much more memorable than any other decade?
It's a really good question. I think because you get these Renaissance periods in history, like the 50s had it, the 80s had it. I think we've had it since the 80s though, but where you get a burst of, a bubble of creativity. You had the socio-political environment in the States. You had some advances in the technology of makeup and prosthetics and sort of monster making technology. You had the VHS era start, so producers didn't necessarily need a cinema release. They could actually create for the VHS market, so it brought down the cost of getting a film out to market. And you had a reaction to the Reaganomics. It was a time where things were quite hostile around you, and I always think horror is intrinsically linked with where society is at that time. So I think that's part of it. But I also think that we got lucky with directors, we got lucky with creative visionaries, we got lucky with people exploring boundaries and telling great stories and memorable stories. It was this sort of convergence of great things, the artwork, the aesthetic, the time. You can't engineer something like that. That's what made this era very magical. And what's interesting now is we even celebrate the bad movies because they mean something to us. I remember going into VHS stores and just picking up a movie because I liked the cover, and the movie would be terrible, completely unrelated to the cover, but I'm still nostalgic for that experience. And what's amazing is that there are future generations. I'm 42, you're 44, that have come after us that love this as well, and it just goes to show that there was something unique and special about that time.
Yeah, you mentioned the bad movies, and it's not just the horror genre. It's every genre. It seems that any movie that came from the 80s, somewhere there's a cult following surrounding it. Like Howard the Duck was that was a punchline in the 80s. There's fans that are fanatical about that movie today. It's just there's, I don't know, something in the water in the 80s. Like you talk to film critics and film historians, they always go on about how the 70s was like one of the greatest eras of film. And obviously great movies came out of the 70s. You can't dispute that. But I think whereas the film critics are obsessed with the 70s, the general populace is just very much entrenched in all the movies of the 80s.
I completely agree. And I think it's difficult because I'm a product of my time. So the 80s for me is hugely emotional. It is nostalgic. 80s horror is a comfort blanket. And in fact, with the community that we have, that every other Sunday we get together for a watch party, and we have like someone who directed the movie or starred in the movie come and join us. for me, it's like time travel. It's like traveling back to when I was a teenager, watching these movies with my friends that we weren't supposed to watch, and it's just a really indulgent experience and fun because we find out more about these movies. We find out how they were made. It kind of engages the intellectual side because I can't experience some of the films that I loved growing up. I don't love in the same way as an adult. They don't do it for me in the same way, but I still have that huge affection for them. So the watch parties where we talk through the whole movie, we'll have a special guest there. It just adds this whole layer of context on top of the film, and it creates a brand new experience, and that's what I love. But it takes me back to my childhood self. And when you get into your 40s, you kind of sometimes need reminding what turned you on when you were, a kid.
And I know exactly what you mean. So, In Search of Darkness 2, when is that going to be available to the public?
Okay, well, it's only going to be available to the public for pre-order until the 31st of October. And everyone that buys gets a name in the credits. The package comes with 3 amazing posters and a year-long season pass to our community, which is going to be loads of activities. So our whole thing is like we want to bring everyone together. We're in a pandemic, lots of people are isolated, and we want to share those fan experiences with everyone. So we've created a platform and experience which is the best I've ever seen. I haven't seen anything that can surpass it. The actual digital versions will be sent out to everybody on the 17th of November, and then all the physical merchandise gets shipped in December.
Okay, and the campaign, I'm going by memory here, that runs till midnight on Halloween?
Yeah, but it's like midnight Honolulu time. But yeah,
Okay.
it's midnight Halloween.
And
Yeah.
I'll have all the links down below, so anyone who wants to pre-order that can do so. And one cool thing about this campaign is, for $15 extra, you can get part 1 on
On
Blu-ray,
Blu-ray.
right?
So the package does contain a digital version of In Search of Darkness, right? So you can binge watch 9 hours of 80s horror, and it contains a digital copy of In Search of Darkness 2 as well as the physical version. But if you want to upgrade to a Blu-ray or DVD of In Search of Darkness, the original, you can do that for $15 more.
That's really cool because a few months ago when I first found out about this, I was looking for the Blu-ray, and it's not easy to come by.
The
So,
aftermarket on eBay, like we've seen, so we did an Elvira collector's edition last October, which retailed, including shipping, for $59.99. That 2 months later, we're turning up on eBay for $250, $300. Like used, right? So, but that's part of what makes us a little bit different. The value proposition is there. If you buy one of these, and you wanted to watch it and then you wanted to sell it, chances are you could sell it for double, triple what you bought it for. And that's as a creator, the value that we put together is evidenced by that, and creating that scarcity is quite important actually because we live in an age where digital consumption is everywhere. Everything's available all the time, and part of the challenge now is that you don't value things. If we put In Search of Darkness up on iTunes, we're competing with Avatar, we're competing with like Black Panther or Avengers or something. Like no, that doesn't make sense to do that. And also this isn't for everybody. This is a 4.5 hour documentary on 80s horror. Like we're very, very targeted on who our customer should be. Joe, you're our customer. You're who we want to create for. I'm not interested in the general audience. We never have been. I mean, we get criticized for it. We get criticized for either being elitist or charging too much. I'm like, no. If you don't see the value, then it's not for you, and that's all right. That's okay. You don't have to get it. It's not aimed at you. It's aimed at the super fans that love this stuff, that get the value out of it and more.
yeah, in our society today, when there is so much out there, not everything has to be for everybody. You've got a ridiculous amount of choices now. So,
Exactly. So, we had to defend ourselves a couple of times on social media, and it's like, what we are creating really for ourselves. We want to create an experience where you don't question the cost because you've had a unique experience that's very tailored to your sensibility. And we've got the best people in the world, brought them all together. These aren't necessarily cheap projects to produce, and but we see the evidence. These are very, very successful projects because we're so targeted.
So can you talk a little bit about In Search of Tomorrow? Because I'm really excited about that one.
You know what, right? That was one of the best experiences I've ever had. So there's something I learned. We spent a year developing that, even before we actually launched the Kickstarter. And the Kickstarter campaign was amazing. It's the fourth highest grossing Kickstarter in history for a documentary. And the film's going to be amazing. We interviewed someone very like an 80s sci-fi A-lister that we're not going to reveal who it is until next March, but that was a big one that we got. And production has slowed a little bit because of COVID, which was part of the reason why we diverted some of our attention to In Search of Darkness 2, because it's like we're just going to have to wait this out a little bit, especially because a lot of the contributors we want are a little bit older. So it's been harder to get them. Everyone's pushed back to Q1 of next year, and we didn't really want that to impact what we're doing. But In Search of Tomorrow is kind of repeating the formula that we developed for In Search of Darkness, but sort of 10xing it. So it's going to be longer than 4.5 hours, that's for sure.
Wow.
Right. And we're going deep dives. I just love the aesthetic. It's been just such a joyous, interesting, cerebral, journey so far. And also the backers. And we have something like 7,200 backers who have contributed to get it to where it is. They're amazing. They've been really supportive. A lot of them come to our watch parties. We have watch parties every other Sunday, so we flip between horror and sci-fi. So the watch parties have been amazing. So we had Brad Dourif come in and do a watch party with June. We had Sam J. Jones, who played Flash Gordon, come and join us for Flash Gordon. He'd never given a commentary before on Flash Gordon, ever. So that was a world exclusive for us, just for members of our community. And so it's a great fun journey. I think, well, without doubt, In Search of Tomorrow will be our best, like by 100 miles, like project to date, because the team, and there's 15 of us at Creator VC, are so hyped for it, and our director David Weiner is doing a stellar job. I mean, these interviews, when he sits down with someone, it's a 2-3 hour conversation. Part of the reason we were able to deliver In Search of Darkness 2 is because we had so much stuff that was great that we couldn't put in to the first one because of the film selection that we went with. And that's because they're really in-depth interviews, so.
And we forgot to mention that 3 of these movies, all but the Action Heroes one, all 3 of the others are directed by David Weiner, is it pronounced?
Yeah.
So yeah, well, and you said In Search of Tomorrow, you're aiming for March for that one?
No, that won't be released in March. We're going to make a big announcement in March.
Okay.
So the release date is scheduled for July, but we're going to reassess that probably around February, because one of the things I've learned with Last Action Heroes, we felt a lot of pressure from our audience because it was crowdfunded to get it out then. And I feel that some mistakes were made, right? And not to do with the film, but just manufacturing and that kind of stuff, because we felt that pressure. But now, because we've kind of established ourselves as a production company, if we need to push back the time by a month or a couple of months, that we will do it in a heartbeat to make sure that the end product is as good as we can make it. Because these last, we're tweeted now from people that have just discovered Last Action Heroes and love it. Our social media, I think we have like 60,000 followers on social media for In Search of Darkness. We have about 20,000 for In Search of Tomorrow. By the time that comes out, that will probably be around 40 or 50,000. And because the films aren't complex, they're simple. It's a simple kind of structure, but because they're such an immersive form of entertainment, and because of how David directs, and it flows very, very well, and because of the amount of contributors, it's not like watching something else. It's a very sort of direct experience if you're a fan of this kind of stuff, and that's what we want to perfect, and I think we will with In Search of Tomorrow. I couldn't be more excited and positive about a project, and we've been well resourced. We have a great lineup of talent, and it's our third. In fact, it will be our fourth project. So we kind of really have refined our own processes. Like, our manufacturers are amazing. They're based in California. The artists we work with, the editors, even our studio base in LA is phenomenal. So everything's been refined, and I think the fans and the backers are going to be in for a treat when that comes out.
So you've done three of these now, well, four, but you've done three different genres: action, horror, and sci-fi. What's your personal favorite genre?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, right? Because there's a lot of genre bleed. So, I mean, I love doing the action documentary. We had like Mario Kazar and Paul Verhoeven, and like it was like kind of getting to meet your heroes. And I love movies like Predator and Terminator, and we get to cover those again in different ways in Search of Tomorrow. Horror is a tricky one because I've got such a deep, like, In Search of Darkness. I remember coming up with the idea on the 14th of July 2018 and writing it out in my sketchbook. Like, this was going to be the look and feel, like sketching out the little boy on the TV and the whole kind of concept with the new retro wave and all of that kind of stuff going into it. And it was literally from the day we started, like, just getting the message out, it just went like that. It was just one of those things that caught the attention really early on. And I feel that 80s horror I'm very connected to in quite a deep way because of the aesthetic. I think that 80s sci-fi has arguably better movies as a genre. It's more cerebral, all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's a hard question. I think it's sci-fi and horror. That's a kind of like, they depending on the weather, they go up and down. Action's a different one because you get hardcore action, 80s action movies, people, but as a genre, it's a lot smaller. Whereas, you get sci-fi conventions, you get horror conventions, you don't really get action conventions.
Yeah, I've always said horror and sci-fi go together. Like, I'm always surprised when I talk to someone who says they're a horror fan that tells me, and it's happened, I don't like sci-fi. I'm like, well, Frankenstein is a sci-fi story. It's like Alien is a horror movie, but it's also it's like they seem very intrinsically linked to
They
me.
they
But
are they are, and there's a lot of crossover and a lot of genre bleed. So, you know, in Search of Darkness, we talked about The Fly, we talked about The Thing, and in Search of Tomorrow, we'll talk about The Fly, we'll talk about The Thing. We got criticized for not including aliens in Search of Darkness, but to me, yeah, it's a horror movie. It's a horror movie, right? But to me, it's a sci-fi movie. It's so in that, and people have said, so how can you justify that? Well, I can't. It's just, it's just a choice we've made, and it's completely arbitrary. So, and we welcome those discussions. I mean, genre is a funny thing anyway because it's fluid. You could argue Predator is a sci-fi movie. You could argue Predator is a horror movie, but I think of it as an action movie because it's got Arnie.
yeah,
So there's horror elements in Terminator, so they're all crossover, and the. But when I think of 80s horror, I think of something very colourful and visceral. When I think of 80s sci-fi, I think of something very sort of neon-y and metallic, and that kind of. So the aesthetics are slightly different. And I think if you can, Aliens to me is a sci-fi movie. Yes, it's a horror movie, but to me, it's It's got all the hallmarks of sci-fi. It's in space. It's got, this amazing aesthetic. It's one of those perfect movies. I mean, that, Predator, The Thing, these are The Fly. These are perfect films, essentially, that you can't improve on them, in my view.
Well, I want to thank you for your time. I appreciate you talking to us. I want to encourage all of my viewers and listeners, if you are interested in 80s horror, please check out these links. You've got until midnight Halloween to place a pre-order, and I've seen the first one. It's worth your time if you're a fan. So thank you, Robin. I appreciate it, and I can't wait to see part 2 and In Search of Tomorrow. Well, what's next? Do you do 80s comedy next?
No, I get asked that. 80s cartoons. We're moving into retro gaming. So
Okay.
in fact, there's two things. For the end of 2021, we want to develop 90s horror. So further the franchise for In Search of Darkness. It'll still be called In Search of Darkness, but In Search of Darkness 90s. But at the end of the year, we want to Pixels, which is about 90s gaming. That's going to be our big one for 2022.
Cool. Awesome. I'm maybe if you got the time, you can come back, talk to us when we get closer to those projects.
And I haven't done any PR. It's David's done all the interviews, and so this was my one interview that I've done. And Joe, I'm really grateful. Thanks for the great questions, and thanks for having me on.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. All right. Have a good day, and everyone keep wearing those pajamas.
Keep wearing those pajamas with the plastic feet. Keep wearing those pajamas. Tell everyone you meet. Keep wearing those pajamas with the back door flap. Keep wearing those pajamas. Don't open it, it's a trap. Oh no, it's a trap. Some people call them bitches. Some people call them jammies. They can come embroidered with big money and no whammies. They can have 100 tiny commander adamas. But no matter how they look, just keep on wearing those pajamas. Keep wearing those pajamas. And now we're having fun. Keep wearing those pajamas. And now the song is done.